From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Peggy Pearlstein, head of the Hebraic section here in the African Middle Eastern Division of the Library of Congress. Welcome to today's program, in which Yermiyahu Ahron Taub will read from his newest book of poetry, Prayers of a Heretic. The title and the book are very apropos with the imminent arrival of the High Holy Day season in just a few days. We didn't plan it that way. Aaron, as we know him here at the library, has previously read from his books, While Stillness Illuminated, Was Stillkeit hat beleuchtet, and Uncle Fagela in 2009 and 2011. Those programs, like today's, were webcast and now appear on the library's website. Aaron is also the author of The Insatiable Psalm, which explored the love between an ultra-Orthodox Jewish mother and her increasingly less observant son. Aaron's Yiddish and English language poems, one of which was nominated for a Pushcart Prize, have appeared in numerous publications, including the Adirondack Review, The Forward, and Prairie Schooner. Jewish Spring, a poem from Uncle Fagela, appeared in the Jewish Forward in its April 18th edition 2 years ago to commemorate National Poetry Month. Most recently, a number of Aaron's poems were set to music by the Warsaw-based composer Michał Gorczynski. The music was performed in May at the New Jewish Music Festival in Warsaw, Poland. Born and raised in an ultra-Orthodox community in Philadelphia, Aaron studied at yeshivot, Orthodox Jewish schools of higher instruction, in Philadelphia and in Baltimore. Aaron is also a Phi Beta Kappa, summa cum laude graduate of Temple University in Philadelphia. He has an MA in History from Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia, and an MLS in Library Science from Queens College in New York City. Active in the Association for Jewish Libraries, Aaron is section head, the Israel Judaica section, Asian and Middle East division of the Acquisitions and Bibliographic Access division of the library. Aaron's new book will be for sale and signing following the reading. But I would like to draw your attention to two upcoming programs sponsored from the Hebraic section. One will be Tuesday, September 17th, and it will be co-sponsored with the Rare Book and Special Collections Division, and it will be held in the Rosenwald Room. It's also a local author, a book talk by Jeremy Brown, M.D., The Jewish Reception of Copernican Thought, the Encounter of Science and Judaism, and we will have a display of Hebrew books and of rare books that Dr. Brown used when he wrote this new book. And we've got another poetry reading, also a local author, on Tuesday, September 24th, when Merrill Leffler will be reading from his book of poetry, Mark the Music. You can also find these on the library's website and on the African Middle Eastern Division website under upcoming events. This event is being videotaped for subsequent broadcast on the library's website and other media. The audience is encouraged to offer comments and raise questions during the formal question and answer period that follows the poetry reading. But please be advised that your voice and image may be recorded and later broadcast as part of this event. By participating in the question and answer period, you're consenting to the library's possible reproduction and transmission of your remarks. And now it is our pleasure to listen to Ahron read a selection of poems from his newest book.
Well, thank you, Peggy, for that lovely introduction. Thank you all for coming. I want to thank Peggy and Ann Brenner of the Hebraic section for inviting me and for all their work in organizing this program, and also Ahmed Chief Dr. Mary Jane Deeb for her support. So what is Prayers of a Heretic about? The book explores the act of heresy and the condition of displacement, refracted through the language of prayer, poetry, prayerful poetry, and other combinations thereof. In the first section, the poet imagines a variety of protagonists in supplication. The second section looks closer at the character of the heretic, the causes and forms of his transgressions. And who is the heretic? The title character has left the Orthodox Jewish world of his youth, but remains engaged in communication with his heritage, and in particular the practice of prayer, albeit of a less traditional kind. Many of the poems in the collection celebrate the power of reading, books, and libraries as avenues for reflection, refuge, and reconfiguration. And I will read several of those poems today. From feedback from readers, it seems that I am sometimes conflated with characters in my books. In fact, one correspondent recently wrote me, admittedly playfully, a letter beginning, "Dear Heretic." Perhaps this is because of the frequent use of the first person, or the striking resemblance of some of my characters' experiences with my own. Or perhaps the idea of autobiography seems to lend an air of the real or the authentic, designations which are themselves highly mediated and subjective. I do not consider any of my poems to be the diary entries or memoir selections of Yermiyahu Ahron Taub. The poems, even those that feature a character named Yermiyahu, are all constructed. Yes, they explore concerns and themes that are of interest to me, but they are necessarily inventions of the imagination. Of course, once a poem, or any work of art for that matter, is out in the world, its interpretation cannot be controlled or managed by its creator. But this introduction gives you at least a general sense of some of my intentions. So with that in mind, let's move now to the poems. And if at any time you can't hear me, just yell, "I can't hear you," because it's hard for me to gauge. The first poem I'm going to read today is called "Two Sisters." Two sisters. Having helped her sister prepare for a rendezvous with a suitor, one among many dashing such, quashing her unease over his beauty and their lack of chaperone. Having selected for her dearest the gray frock and the rose shawl and the bonny bonnet, hours of hawing and hemming, literally, coaxing and cajoling, until finally here, this silence, although all of that was pleasurable too, in a way, she freely admits. Well, there's almost silence, for she can hear the delirium of their father long confined to his mysterious sickbed. Having prepared the meals for tomorrow, checking again the icebox for the cold cuts and the salad, yes, they are there. Yes, they will be enough. Having set aside their father's medicines per the doctor's orders, although secretly she wonders how matters would stand if there were another doctor in town. The word charlatan flits through her mind. She's seen her share. Having removed the work dress, hue long forgotten, from months, then years of cooking and scrubbing and sweeping and best forgotten activities. Having donned the ironed white camisole, as if virginal, with its flowered lace collar, salvaged from her mother's sewing box, still in the attic. Until she sits before the mirrored stand, also once their mother's, and applies the array of creams to her still unlined face, inhaling their scents, peach, pomegranate, persimmon of all things, the gifts of the orchard, of the orchards that dispel the carriage just departed, in which a man's large hands are now stealing her sister's body, and the absence of hands over her own, until she stretches in bed and opens the novel of manners, having abandoned the novels favored, at least until tonight, by her sister, until she scrawls notes for her reading group on the protagonist's pluck, having revived from options waned, market crash, bow gone amuck, until she tickles its spine, clasps it against her breast, then closes its doors against the illustration of a fate so different from her own. This next poem is about Yiddish. It's called Staged Reading. She responded to the ad at a friend's suggestion, albeit with reluctance. It had been decades since she had spoken the language, longer still since reading it. She had not been the most attentive of after-school students, as her mother used to remind her in an institution not unlike this one. Dredging was the only verb for all of this, she thought. She made no effort to disguise her concern to the coordinator, who only pooh-poohed her. It's like riding a bike, she chuckled grimly. And then with greater candor, besides, it's able bodies we need here. The corridors, painted in beiges and taupes, failed to mitigate the occupants in various stages of disintegration. Nor could the games, the game shows, the flowers, the orderlies and pastels muffle the walkers, the canes, and buzz of the hearing aids. The television's too loud, the pills almost forgotten, the wigs askew. The paraphernalia of the past prime, the din of near death, she shivered. She placed her hand on the doorknob to his room. How ought his role be named? Charge, listener, reedy? He sat in a wheelchair by the window, wisps of hair fluttering over dark glasses, wearing a gray Oxford shirt and black dress slacks, a whiff of aftershave hovering. Someone had taken care. After introductions, she opened the volume from the right side, the letters neither exotic nor familiar. Dreading a tumult of emotion, she had not prepared for the reading. And yet the words tumbled forth, the vowels providing signage. She chose a classic monologue about a ne'er-do-well husband and his wife long suffering, given to juicy invective. A way of life closing. Sometimes he would interrupt, or rather call out along with the text, as if her reading simply confirmed what he already knew and had always known these many years, only waiting for someone, for her specifically, this no longer young woman in tweeds, to render it spoken. When she looked up or came to, night had arrived. His head did not droop, his eyes smiled. She blushed at his compliments on her reading, at his gratitude gushed. If only my students, flitted through her mind. Jittery now, she leaned into his left ear, peppered with black hair. À tout à l'heure, she whispered. Of course there will be a next time. His favorite patron, and this poem is set in a library. His favorite patron. She came every morning a half hour after opening. Her punctuality breathtakingly reliable, if only we took the time to admire. Only there were materials piled high, particularly from prolific, bearded men in black and white calling our attention, and queries from those hunting for traces of antecedents, desperate for evidence, any scrap anywhere of the couple photographed so long ago in front of the painted backdrop of French doors and silk portieres. The squeak of her shopping cart wheels heralded her arrival. A halo of body unwashed for weeks odor shone all around. Her hair hung down in limp strands, often covered by a wool hat, even in heat. Her body was wrapped in rags and bags and blankets and coats of indeterminate hue, so caked in matter were they. Even in penning this ode, it is impossible to sanitize the physicality of the filth. There was a monumentality to her entrance that had to be granted. She set up station at the same spot by a long wooden table, retrieved an encyclopedia volume from the shelf, and fell, smiling, into a sleep at once profound and buoyant. How he marveled at that sleep, he who tossed and thrashed and stared slack-jawed at infomercials late into night. What was the secret of her successful rest? She who surely traversed the city in storm and sun in search of the means of survival, he wondered. Perhaps it was the fact of her body on this chair in the biblio light. Hours and positions may be subject to budget nips and tucks, but the institution would stay. Did she know this? Did this provide serenity from the chaos of the outside? Or perhaps there was no chaos outside at all. Perhaps there was simply a path, a creativity sculpted from budgetlessness, honed these many years. And yet why here? He never asked her any of these questions. He only knew this. Of all the rooms in this marble palace of knowledge, resplendent with hand-painted angels and roses, constructed to dazzle in an era when learning was venerated, she came to this one, to the one devoted to the writings of a tiny nation, hounded over the millennia, whose citizens were happiest, apparently, with book in hand and plume on hand. Of all the rooms, she came to ours. We gave her shelter. Here she found home. This next poem is about a teacher turned registrar, and it's called Pied Piper on Holiday. Pied Piper on holiday. After disembarking from the taxi, he locates the rooms advertised, the words discreet and private, the only clues given or needed. He scans the view of the courtyard, the one less cherished than that of the village or the mountains, the fruit trees, the mosaics, the fountain gurgling. Gurgling, was that the word he wanted? He is pleased by the iron bed with its rough blanket, the paint flaking off the walls, the porcelain water pitcher and bowl, and the flowered border of the white cloth crossing the nightstand that serves as the lone ornamentation in the room. He is familiar with rooms such as this one, and in fact prefers them to his own, with their studied refinement and curios briefly registered. Zagreb, September 19. Jerba Island, ND, not dated. Such is his manner at home, cautious but eclectic. It is enough that he does such work by day, Well, not exactly, since he often works into the night. Let us say it is enough that this is his livelihood, to which he is devoted and well regarded by the few who know and care. At home, he permits himself some slack, or freedom, shall we say further. And yet some continuity must be maintained. He is amused by these pleasures, minor they may be. He hears voices in reflection, not muffled exactly, but modulated, and is glad for them, for the tautness of their contribution to his time here. He remembers the anticipation of long ago, the sounds of children entering the schoolyard, how he pooled his calm prior to each lesson, how he drew the children in with his tales, savored the transformation of their restlessness into rapture, what others would later call seduction. When he considers the verb to sack, he thinks of sackcloth, and how, yes, there is a kind of mourning that happens, or ought to in any case, not only for those children whose names he whispers, P, M, but for others like them for the children of the children who might have reminded him of their parents, for the chalk dust, for the giggles, for the penmanship, shedding tentativeness. Instead, he will catalog objects to ensure their importance in the history of loveliness. He will hope that the children who might have been will come upon them, and he will remain glad for rooms such as this one, with their blankness, in these varied locations, where certain kinds of connections can be made, where certain kinds of comfort can be found. This next poem is one of 4 poems that have a Yiddish version. I'm only going to read the English one today. And it's called Regina's Requiem for a Friend. You should have been there. The blaze from the heavens onto the river, through the floor-to-ceiling windows, truly was a flood. Water light, no water fire. Only FEMA was not needed. It was possible to perceive shifts in time, the transition of day to dusk, then, finally, night itself luminous. You could have observed, if only that, had you so elected, that is. No one would have minded. You should have been there. Everyone was there. And yet it was never too much. I knew this upon entry. I navigated the repartee and the winding lanes of bodies, searching for you. My hair was held back with Nana's rhinestone combs that you so admired. I wore a wine-colored silk number that we found in the vintage boutique in Louisville. You would have been pleased. I was excited to see your ensemble. I was sure you were going to outdo yourself. You should have been there. I asked about you, but nothing was known. Raphael said you were coming. He was eager to hear what you would be reading for us. Lucia performed a cycle of songs from the Spanish Civil War. Ian and Dusty read from their new 2-man show. They open next week. Jim's new boyfriend, whose name escapes me, rendered an homage to Nijinsky, both macho and tender. It was all so very sublime. You would not have chided me on my hyperbole. You should have been there. I kept spotting your type throughout. Some did not even seem paired. You would have enjoyed sampling the eye candy. There was even some petting in the corners, but quite relaxed. Raphael really went all out with the spread, too. His cooking has garnered raves from the most finicky of palates, and all this from the queen of late-night takeout. Who would have guessed? You should have been there. We could have sang the Laverne and Shirley theme song, skipping home on the icy flagstones past the locked park. You could have slept in my bed like old times. Liam is out of town. We could have had scones with preserves in the morning. How could you not have been there? How could I not have insisted? I should have dragged you there. If you had only been there, you might yet be here. So as we know, the Jewish people are often called the people of the book. So this next poem is a dystopic poem in which the poet imagines a scenario in which a decree has been released forbidding Jews to have paper books, printed books. And it's called The People of the Book, ... without books, ? The wives whispered at the butcher and in the market, and on departing the bathhouse after ritual immersion. The husbands in the houses of study, and while selecting the citrons and palm branches. They shook their heads and clicked their tongues, looking down so as not to see. It was shocking, as you can imagine, and yet not, in that way that only decrees affecting the people of the book can be. Only just released, it was already plastered on bulletin boards, outside prayer halls, and on doors and telephone poles, seemingly ubiquitous, yet no one quite knew how they had gotten there, since no one had been seen posting them. Is there a traitor among us? A meeting in the synagogue was convened on Tuesday evening. After long prayers composed for occasions such as this, shouting erupted. The rabbi proved unable to control the frenzy, which could well have been heightened by the days of fasting. The burly beadle and his henchmen, whose physical prowess was feared by Jew and Gentile alike, had to restore order. Even if temptations of the flesh could be completely filtered out to save us and our children from ruin, the synagogue's chief benefactor wondered. And that is far from a given, for cunning is the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination. Could legal permission actually be granted? How shall we pray on the Sabbath and on holidays when electronic devices are forbidden? And how dare we depart from the path of our ancestors, they who touched and swayed over and died for these holy books? And from the ground below, where the fragments are buried, cried the cantor, in intonation normally reserved for the days of awe. And how shall the weekly Torah portion be recited, the words that unite our people in homeland and diaspora? For surely scrolls will not be spared, wept the Torah reader, so young and already renowned across several provinces, for a style of cantillation stunning in its precision of enunciation and mastery of melody. We shall descend underground. No, we shall study the ways of the martyrs. Enough. God will reveal the means, the rabbi said, resuming prayer. Leaves rustling in gratitude, only the trees rejoiced. Okay, I have to get ready for this next one. Okay. This next poem is called Yermiyahu, the Book Peddler. It could be a day cloudless, geometric to the touch. It could be a day metallic, heavens dully closing in. It does not matter. The question of portent is of no relevance here. You will see a figure pulling a wagon, stooped over the horizon, first a dot, and then coming into focus, and the calls that grow louder. Poetry, poetry for sale, poetry, poetry for sale. The housewives swing open their windows, their bosoms dangle listlessly. The children gather around the figure, his hat askew. poking under the volumes, rifling through his pockets for coins or lollipops. When none materialize, a few tug at his pants, one even kicks his shins, if with little enthusiasm. No rocks are thrown, at least that. A dandy scans the jumble. "Something for my sweetie," he says, dark locks veiling the skepticism beginning to coalesce. Away he saunters, off to the flower vendor, no doubt, or perhaps to the confectionery, where he will send the girls in pink into peals of giggles with his impersonation of the Book Peddler. Mina, the mayor's maiden aunt, fingers the amulet tucked beneath her collar, leaves to locate the lines that can encapsulate the enormity of her inchoate desire. It could be a night starless. It could be a night ravaged by lightning. It does not matter. The question of tangibility is of no relevance here. You will see a figure just below the horizon, static in size and proportion, skirts billowing about, crumpled on a silk blanket, and a kerosene lamp swaying above the wagon. You will hear the calls, now murmured, careening through the concerto of night birds. Poetry, poetry for sale, poetry, poetry for sale. Trains passing in the railroad apartment. Once my father came to visit me, the only family member ever to have done so in the more than 20 years since my exodus. He slipped past my Italian landlady, sitting sentry without a second look. Perhaps his long beard and black coat in summer scorch set something ablaze in her, having to do with robes swishing from rooms murky with moans for repentance, down alleyways into the piazza, pigeons rising in outrage, stirring something altogether enormous and familiar, despite the difference in tradition. Perhaps. She, not given to reserve, never mentioned it. I'll never know now. As he passed through my mezuzah-less doorway, I wondered whether Father's purity would cleanse or at least elevate the impurity here. Or would the reverse take place? I so wanted him to feel, if not comfortable, then at least not implausible in this setting. I had debated for weeks which posters to take down for his visit. Is Vermeer's girl wearing turban as improper as the outline of the nude woman on the Chez Panisse 1977 Garlic Festival? The sages, after all, forbid glancing at even the smallest finger of a woman. Could the maiden of modesty be exempted? What about the prohibition on graven images? I had considered hiding some of the books, but ultimately decided against it. There were simply too many, nearly all appalling in some way. Where would I put the acres of them? Besides, who did I think I was fooling? Certainly not Father, who reclined on the green chair, his back turned against both young ladies in question, his fedora and coat on the ottoman salvaged from the Housing Works thrift shop. After he declined fruit and nuts, the food offerings I had thought to be least affected by the laws of kashrut, Father elaborated with characteristic elegance on a passage in the weekly Torah portion. I wish I had taken notes. Even then, I knew this was an event worthy of documentation. But for once, the Torah seemed to have failed Father. He soon asked to lie down. I guided him to the windowless bedroom in my railroad apartment, our roles momentarily reversed. I landed in the front room, swaying by the window, peering down on my landlady on the stoop, my knuckles white from not trembling, my eyes red from not weeping. How are we doing? This next poem is called Editor's Edict, or Bowed by Absence, and it explores the question that so many bilingual writers ask, is what to glossarize, when to glossarize, whether there should be a glossary at all. What should the writer assume the audience knows? Editor's Edict. She said, a poem has to stand on its own. It should not need a glossary. So here goes. This will be a poem without signage of any kind. Turn here for the meaning of X. Squat here to discover a hint into Y. In vain will you scour for aspects of otherness revealed or repressed. You cannot help but crave these assurances. You have become accustomed to them. Allow your fingers, however they may tremble, to grope the walls, jagged in their flatness. There will be bandages on hand should they get bloodied. Be sure not to stumble over those pesky etymological speed bumps. Make your way down the linoleum-tiled corridor, past the locked doors to the shuttered windows. You will wonder where they might have led. The squeak of your sneakers will announce your unencumbered tread. You will have just managed to skirt the ungainliness of translation, it seems, the burden of the asterisk, the heartbreak of approximation. You did so want to mediate. You can't shake the daydream of yourself as diplomat, with banter and enigmatic expression, beneath sputtering sconces, amidst winter coats slowly donned. How do you say shucks in the hovering tongue? Your eyes water in the uniformity of it all. Just beyond your vision field, willow branches sweep a plain of nearly forgotten diminutives, once thought quaint. Ever so faintly, a gray tomcat sniffs a clump of steaming colloquialisms. Anxiously, you reach for the bilingual dictionary. This next poem is about externalizing those critical voices. It's called On Being a Minorities Poet. Your poems are too gay. Your poems are too universal. Your poems are too sexual. Your poems are too squeamish. Your poems are too Jewish. Your poems are too assimilationist. Your poems are too religious. Your poems are too worldly. Your poems are too Yiddishy. Your poems are too translated. Your poems are too accessible. Your poems are too elusive. Your poems are too ornate. Your poems are too austere. Your poems are too emotional. Your poems are too intellectual. Your poems are too political. Your poems are too decadent. Your poems are too scandalous. Your poems are too tame. Your poems are too self-absorbed. Your poems are too socially aware. Your poems are too heavy. Your poems are too blithe. Your poems are too flat. Your poems are too sparkly. Your poems are too narrative. Your poems are too character-driven. Your poems are too dialectic. Your poems are too polyphonic. Your poems are too dissonant. Your poems are too smooth. Your poems lack variety. Your poems lack cohesion. Your poems are too monochromatic. Your poems are too gaudy. Your poems are too old-fashioned. Your poems are too experimental. Your poems are too prosy. Your poems are too... No, what I really want to say is this. Have you considered writing short stories? This next poem is about the book as artifact, and it's called Eavesdropping. This is some of what can be found in a book. Who owned it, from the library of, the signing, the shapes of the scrawl, the ardor vibrating in the dedication. For Dorothea, in fond remembrance of our sojourn in Bratislava. And as if in Morse code, the notes of others. Tell Bruno to bring home the bacon. This is some of what can be left in a book. Store receipts, especially the handwritten ones from the vintage shops, doctor's prescriptions, Chinese fortune cookie maxims, plumber bills, the phone number of the man in the shadows of an East Village dive bar, the photo of the ex with P-flag moms at a pride parade. The after-hours pass, still so crisp, to visit mother in the hospital. This is some of what can be felt on a book. The red and yellow ink hovering just above the margins of its pages, the fingers that smudged, caressed the corners, and passed it on and on until it arrived in this antique smart off the interstate. Delivered to me, skepticism measured, weighed, until finally banished by the fact of these words, cosseted, this object discovered. The fragrances of fellowship in the 24-hour diner. Care for a refill, hun? The disappearance of sugar cube into freshly brewed elixir as the crowd files in, for the bars have finally let out. Whatever are the no longer baby dykes wearing these days? The waitresses returning the flirt, the plot, argument, rhythm, music that cannot be set aside for all this ruckus so sweet, the denouement revealed, conversion confirmed in the contentment of the reader, framed Hopperesquely in the plate window. Born of these words, framed thus in the unhurried turning of page, in the hard hats, overalls, the arrival, can it be already, of the early morning construction worker shift. The silt scattering from gingerly opened covers years later, pottery fragments from a classical era. The unbinding of manuscript splinters from the almost musty binding of accepted truth. Hieroglyphics you will have to master someday. Come now, gather and decipher. Okay, and the last poem of today's reading, and also of the book, is called Beach Glass Necklace. There are no carousels nearby, no children's laughter painted in the hue and music of yesteryear. There are no aromas of cotton candy and popcorn and taffy to blunt the wind and wave and witness. There are no prohibitions nailed to planks, no sentries posted to denounce suspicious movement from a throne on high. There are others around and about, to be sure, and yet we don't think to assess theirs and ours in relation to theirs. We take step as if we know, as if we've always known. Eyes averted, we smile from within the glee of skin. Umbrellas and chairs have been omitted. We will not be shielded. The terra infirma of these sands are not ours to claim, however briefly. There is only the path of this interlacing, the salt on beards, the shapes of limbs in braided repose, the rise and fall of breath audible in the whoosh of afternoon, the reeds whispering to the heavens in the ear's silver screen, the amusement of gulls at the frugality of our tango. Even if ever we come to fall in the carnival of mirrors, we will always have had this day. Thanks. Okay, questions? Comments? Michael?
Well, I came in late, so you might have explained it, but one thing that struck me was you seem to be addressing an unnamed female in a lot of
The question was I addressing an unknown female? There were female characters in some of the poems. Let me see. Two sisters, stage reading, his favorite patron, Regina's Requiem. So I guess that's 5. Yeah, I mean 5 had female characters. But what you might have missed was I talked about how these poems are constructions and stories, that they're not necessarily representations of me. So some of the poems do indeed have a female character. I can't necessarily say why I chose a female character. In all of those cases, it just worked better. Well, the bag lady was, just had to be the bag lady. And stage reading seemed to come to me as a mother-daughter situation. And 2 sisters, well, they're 2 sisters. So, yeah, those are the female characters that I read. I try to write in voices of both genders. I write what comes to me, what seems to work poetically and narratively, what seems to make the strongest poem. Yeah. Others? Anne.
Thank you. I was wondering if you see a thematic link or progression between the different books.
So the question was if I see a thematic link or progression between the different books. Interesting. The first book, as Peggy mentioned, is a conversation between a religious mother and her son, who's becoming less religious, her gay son. The second book was broader in theme and voice, and was focused more on being bilingual, being multilingual, and using that 5-line format. The third book had a character named Uncle Fagala, who I would say was maybe a little more connected physically to the religious world from which he sprang. This book, there's less of that physical presence of the heretic in his previous world, but the conversation still goes on. So I guess all 4 books share that broad theme of talking about religion, being haunted by it, pursued by it, engaging with it. But they all approach it in different ways. It appears throughout all. I would say in the second book, is the most experimental, the most free. Which isn't to say that these books are limited to those themes, as you can see. So, I mean, I do try to write broadly and have a connecting leitmotif throughout my books, but not all of my poems are about, the heretic. You don't need to, in fact, I didn't really read that many there's a heretic sequence in this book, which I didn't read. So yeah. Other questions? Eve, yeah.
We all know that you work quite hard here frequently. And how do you balance your writer's life with your 9 to 5:30 or 30 to 5? How does that all work out? Because I'm assuming that you travel around and talk about your poetry, read your poetry, etc. All play out.
So the question was, how do I balance my working life, my 9 to 5 job, with my life as a writer? Not easily. I just make the time for it. I write. Writing to me is like breathing and eating and sleeping. There's never a time when I'm not thinking about a poem, constructing a poem, editing a poem, improving a poem, changing, etc. It's just part of the DNA. But yeah, that said, it's challenging. In this book, as I explained in my introduction, there are a number of poems about librarianship. And there's even one about cataloging. So imagine that. Fascinating. Who knew? So this book was a case where my two worlds kind of came together in a way, which was kind of exciting for me to find the kind of drama in my work, the kind of drama in libraries, which are not often thought of as sites of drama, or avenues for drama. But in general, I just make the time. Traveling is tough. Yeah, I probably should do more to promote. I would like to do more, but it just takes so much work, and I just cannot spend all my leave time organizing readings. And sometimes I'll try to coordinate a reading with a vacation. So if I'm going somewhere, I might see if there's someone interested in having a reading. Yeah, that happened in Israel. Sometimes I'll try to coordinate a reading if I'm traveling for work, like for AJL, our Association of Jewish Libraries Conference, and that happened in Chicago. So I do try to combine things and try to be resourceful, getting the word out on my tight time frame and limited budget. Yeah, thanks. One more question? Yeah, Nick. Oh, okay. Is there time? So Nick asked if there's time, I can read a little bit of the version of one of the Yiddish poems. Let me see if I can find that one. Sorry. Okay. So how about if I read the first stanza of Regina's Requiem? Okay. Regina's Requiem zur Freund. Du hast gesollt dorten sein, das Flackern von die Himmeln auf den Teich, durch die Dill des Stellia Fenster, ist Taka gewen amabel. Wasserlicht, nein, Wasserfeier. Nur Fima hat mir nicht gedarft. Es ist gewen möglich zu der Sehn Änderungen in Zeit, dem Übergang von Tag in Bena Schmasches herein. Und zum Soft, Nacht allein lichtig. Du wollst gekannt nur das Sinn, das heißt, wenn du wollst azoi beschlossen. Es wohl keinem nicht geahrt. Okay, so there's a little taste of Yiddish. Yay. Thank you all.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.